Hey, Seth David here from the world famous Nerd Enterprises Incorporated, bringing to you tip number 2 on Bulletproof Bookkeeping for real estate agents. If you happen to miss tip number 1, just check the description for the link, and I'll make sure it's there for you so you can catch up. Also, if you happen to be catching this before September 18th, 2023, check for another link below where you can click and sign up for my early bird wait list so that you can get early access to the bonuses and the offer that I'm going to release as far as the new agent module in my Bulletproof Bookkeeping with QuickBooks Online for real estate brokers and agents course. Now, let's talk about tip number 2. Keep a record of all expenses, including mileage and marketing costs. Now, another one, just like the first one, you're going to say, duh, Seth, tell me something I don't know. And again, I want to dive into the less obvious details of why this is so important. And we're not going to talk about accounting software yet, right? So let's say you're a brand new agent bootstrapping. I don't care what you use, but you'd better use something to keep track of this stuff. Eventually, if not right away, you're going to want to use accounting software like QuickBooks Online. We'll talk about that in a future tip. But for now, let's say you just use Google Sheets. I don't care. The bottom line is you need to keep track of all those expenses. As an agent, you're on the road a lot, going from listing to listing, doing showings. Hopefully, you've got a lot of that to do, lots of listings to close, right? You're going to want to keep track of your mileage so that you can deduct the business portion of the miles that you drive with your car. Every receipt that you want to deduct needs to be kept. Now, technically, the IRS doesn't require you to keep any receipts for anything under $75. But since this is bulletproof bookkeeping, I'm going to say keep them all anyway. First of all, it's one less decision to make, right? If I have to stop and look at every receipt and decide, well, if it's less than 75, I can throw it away, that's an extra decision to make. To me, it's actually much more streamlined to just be in the habit of saving every receipt and get it scanned, right? Paper can be destroyed. Ink on paper, especially a lot of receipts that you get, the ink fades quickly, right? Get a scanner. Don't spare any expense here. Spend the money. Get a Fujitsu Scan Snap. That's what I use. That's what practically every one of my accounting and bookkeeping colleagues uses so that you can get those receipts scanned and preserved permanently and digitally, and you don't have to worry about where you're going to find that later, because we're also going to talk about a system for keeping track of that stuff so that if you need to pull up a receipt to prove an expense, you can in 30 seconds or less. So get a scanner. I mentioned about the receipts under $75 and the business mileage. Now, it's important to keep a mileage log so you can show, here's the total miles I drove this year. Here's how many were for business. You want to be able to back that up, documenting, the addresses that you went to and where you traveled from, so you can, if need be, prove out the business portion of your auto expenses that you're deducting. Really, really, really important. Now, I specifically called out marketing costs here. The simple reason why is because as agents, that's going to be most of the expenses you incur on a listing, which is primarily what you want to be able to track. At the end of the day, and we're also going to talk about this, you're going to want to be able to pull up a profit and loss statement that shows here's the commission I earned on this listing, and here are all the expenses. And most of those expenses are going to be your marketing expenses. I learned this lesson actually working with an agent years ago who, when I was first putting his books together, and he had none to speak of before he came to me, I took his printing costs and stuck them in an account called Printing and Reproduction, which is a very standard bookkeeping account to use for that kind of thing. And when he looked at that, he said, no, I want this in advertising because, as he pointed out, everything he prints, every sign, its purpose is to advertise the listing. And I certainly wasn't going to argue with him. I said, makes total sense. So that's what we'll do. And I reclassified everything to his advertising expense. So moral of the story is advertising and marketing expenses are important for any business, but especially for a real estate agent. So we definitely want to make sure we're keeping track of all of these expenses. And if it hasn't been obvious enough yet, but I haven't actually called it out, so it goes without saying, but I'll say it, that you want to be able to track each of these expenses to the appropriate listing where applicable. So again, you can do a simple spreadsheet in the beginning. Just keep track of what you spent, who you spent it with, the date, and which listing it goes with. And eventually we'll talk about getting that information into a proper accounting system when the time comes and when you're ready. So again, tip number 2, keep records of all of your expenses, mileage, and especially your marketing and advertising expenses. And then stay tuned for tip number 3 coming out in the next day or two.